The ocean at dawn is a kind of silence that listens back. On June 4th, 1942, with the sea still iron gray and the wind a patient hand over the Pacific, an American submarine rose until its periscope broke the surface like a reed. A disk of glass breached, caught a smear of distant wakes, and ducked back down. Inside the steel tube, sweat-beaded faces glanced to the captain, and the boat seemed to hold its breath with them. She was old for a knife fight like this USS Nautilus, a long-bodied giant from an earlier generation, deeper-chested than the sleeker boats following her to war. She carried stories in her rivets. She also carried torpedoes that too often lied. Her skipper, Lieutenant Commander William H. Brockman, Jr., had learned that in the opening months of the war, the Mark XIV, the Navy's pride, ran deep, struck shallow, or met its targets with a dull thud that sounded like regret. He'd been told to aim true and trust the machine. He had learned to aim truer still and trust the moment more. At 0650, through magnified gray, Brockman's periscope saw the thing he'd been sent to find, and the thing men in pearl-buttoned offices had been praying to catch. A Japanese carrier force, the Codebreaking, not ghosts on a chart, but shapes, tall and fast, stacked with aircraft on decks that shone like satin in the low light. 4 carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu escorted by cruisers and destroyers that chopped white into the blue. Somewhere behind them, an admiral weighed smell of fuel against fear of surprise, and made the kind of calculations that pretend to be mathematics, but are really about the human capacity to wait. Nautilus slid closer. Up periscope, Brockman said, almost as if reminding the order to be gentle. The world above strobed into view, small, precise, full of opportunity and damage. He saw a destroyer slicing past a knife, with spray for a handle. He saw the carriers, their black flight decks set against the pale sea like sentences laid over a page. He set angles, spoke numbers, felt time shorten into a length he could hold in his mind without it slipping. Men around him gripped their own pieces of the moment and steadied them. The United States had learned at Pearl Harbor what it meant to have its war chosen for it. The Japanese Imperial Navy had rewritten the first chapter. Midway was meant to be the counter-argument. Codebreakers in Honolulu cigarettes, coffee, and translating machines that clicked and sulked had teased AF into Midway. Nimitz had decided to spring the trap inside the trap. He placed his carriers east of the small atoll like a closed hand and waited for the Japanese to reach for it. But if you look closely at the day that would turn the Pacific, you find smaller hinges, low to the deck, hidden in spray and steel, and one of them is shaped like a submarine. In the Nautilus's control room, the air smelled of oil and men. Sonar pinged in a patient, hollow voice, measuring distance with sound that does not lie. The helmsman followed orders with fingers that had been told to disobey tremors. The torpedomen, tucked toward the bow with their 10-foot murderers, made small bargains with belief. "Stand by," said Brockman. A destroyer the kind that sits on your chest and listens to your heartbeat through the steel turned toward the rising bubble and the brass of a periscope head. In destroyers, men tell themselves they own the ocean down to 300 feet. In submarines, men teach themselves not to believe in ownership at all. The destroyer came like a verdict. Depth charges are not sound. They are moments that rewrite the world. A string crashed into the water, and a heartbeat later the Pacific tried to step through Nautilus's hull. Lights dimmed, then rallied. Men swallowed, because swallowing is how you persuade panic to wait. Brockman did not go deep. He threaded between impulses. Shallower to keep the periscope up, deeper to quiet the wake. "Steady," he said, but it sounded like, "Trust me." And the boat did. Brockman caught the carrier's flank, a long black sentence between the periscope's crosshairs. He guessed the fleet speed, the angle on the bow. He ordered 2 torpedoes loosed at Kaga. In the forward room, hands moved, levers hissed, gyros spun, and 2 Mark 14s stabbed ahead into futures they did not earn. Nautilus dipped to endure another pounding. When the crew raised the scope again, fruitless bubbles from exploding air bladders scribbled where the destruction should have been. The destroyer was back, eager to introduce steel to pressure. Somewhere inside Nautilus, a rating swore in a whisper, as if to avoid offending the steel, or the ocean, or God. Above, on a flight deck smooth as promise, Japanese deck crews tied down aircraft and fetched bombs. Below, a submarine that had technically failed waited to become important the old-fashioned way by being stubborn in the right place. If you are looking for suspense, it is not found only in the rush of planes. It lives here too. A haunted steel cylinder refusing to withdraw. A captain choosing inches. A destroyer Arashi assigned to kill this pest, throttling up in righteous anger. In a minute, that destroyer would make a line on the ocean no one in the Nautilus could see, and no one in the carriers above could afford to notice white water, urgent and straight, a sketch on the sea like chalk on a chalkboard. Another man 10 miles to the east would look down at that line and decide, running out of fuel, to follow it. Between those 2 decisions lies a hinge that did not groan when it turned. It whispered. To grasp how one submarine became a finger on the scale of a battle, you need the context of a war that had specialized in pushing Americans to learn faster than comfort allows. The submarine service had been America's quiet arm in a navy grown proud of battleships and carriers. It had entered the war in the Pacific with boats that swam well enough and torpedoes designed to do everything except what war requires first: explode on target. The Mark 14 was too clever by half-magnetic exploder, contact exploder, depth-setting ratio each feature an opportunity for failure. In the opening months, captains wrote reports full of words like premature and dud, and then added their own, less polite vocabulary. Bureau men in Washington resisted criticism as if the critiques were aimed at their hearts rather than their mechanisms. Brockman had already risked his career by sending up flares of truth in the language of the Navy. He suspected that the only thing more dangerous than an enemy destroyer was a Mark 14 you had convinced yourself to trust. The men in his torpedo rooms had learned to work luck into their rituals. A tap on the housing ear, a prayer to a saint their mothers would recognize there, a nervous joke that tried to pickpocket fear and shove it in someone else's pocket. When he saw the carriers, Brockman also saw through the periscope's circle the entire argument between theory and reality, and knew reality did not care what one believed. The Japanese had crossed their own finish line with elegance at Pearl and soared again across the Indian Ocean. Their carrier doctrine was an Aang, orchestral thing fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, rising and returning like movements in a piece. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, not a romantic, but a man tied to doctrine as to a mast, rowed his flagship Akagi with weather and timing and doctrine in both hands. Off Midway, he faced a classic problem with an unclassical solution out there to be taken. What do you do with planes that have returned one mission armed for a target that no longer matters when a new, more dangerous target has been found. He hesitated in a way that looks easy to judge from chairs that do not move, and his decks became the most important clutter in the Pacific ponds and torpedoes. Fuel lines snaking like hasty handwriting. Men rushing to undo and redo tasks as contradictory orders reach them. There is another context, older and warmer. Nautilus carried men, not symbols. The boat had bunks that smelled like everyone who had slept in them since December, and coffee that tasted like relief, filtered through socks. The chief of the boat had a voice that could talk a panic into staying in a pocket. In the control room, the young helmsman, he had lied about his age by not contradicting a recruiter, watched the angle indicator with eyes that learned quickly. The sonar man closed his eyes, because sound is easier to hold when sight is quiet. Bearing mark. The talking sounded like ritual. It was ritual. Ritual is how people survive the unrepeatable. The destroyer that harried them, Arashi, had a job as old as sea fights swat the wasps before they sting the queen. She circled, she dropped, she went silent and then charged, as if the silence was the breath before a shout. Depth charges came in patterns that a man can pretend to predict, until a new pattern punishes prediction itself. Brockman, stubborn, held. He wanted another shot. He wanted to write his own sentence on the morning. His patience felt like bravery because it was. He coasted the Nautilus in that thin layer of the sea where periscope lenses taste air and propeller wakes right in foam. He got it another glance up, another slate of angles. The carriers were there, still breathing, still dangerous in their neatness. He ordered fired again. Torpedoes ran a line of power and intention becoming a shape under the sea. And again, nothing on the surface rewarded risk with destruction. The destroyer returned with anger men heard through the steel. Because anger vibrates, it doesn't just shout. Nautilus rocked, lights flickering like a chapel's candles in a wind. Paint dust sifted from the ribs. If you prefer certainty, find another battle. Midway gave few guarantees to anyone. Above, American torpedo squadrons VT-8, VT-6, VT-3 found the carriers one by one and flew in at low altitude through fighters waiting like hawks. They were brave in a movie way and deadly in a way the movies cannot capture because the death took its time. The Mark 13 torpedoes, slung beneath their bellies, failed with a duty that felt personal, and dozens of young men went into the water or into the decks of ships they did not damage and gave in a kind of gift that breaks language. If you want the dive bomber's moment to be pure, you must set on one side these men whose blood hauled the Japanese fighter cover down to wave height and stretched a few minutes into the American column of time. Inside Nautilus, duty narrowed into keeping the periscope up, the boat level, the captain unhurried. A destroyer that believes itself owed a kill rarely stops to choose poetry. Arashi stayed, sentenced by her responsibility to a task that has no clear ending. She dropped again, and then, after a long quarrel made of rumble and pause, she turned north and opened her throttle to rejoin the carrier she'd been born to guard. Her wake became a single white line drawn hard and fast on the ocean's page. It is hard to see a line from a periscope. It is easy to see it from 1,000 feet up. Wade McCluskey, leading 3 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise, faced his own practical end. He had led his men toward coordinates where the Japanese should have been and found only ocean. His fuel was a fact that did not care about hope. He could turn back and save his planes and be wise. He could search farther, be foolish and find only regret. He looked down and saw the arrow Arashi had drawn. He gambled not on luck, but on human behavior. Destroyers in war do not speed alone across open water. They are always on their way to something. He turned and followed. Those minutes would change where his bombs exploded and where a century's story bends. In Histories of Midway, the submarines part is a paragraph that sometimes shows up, sometimes does not. A boat shoots, the shots do not explode. A destroyer chases her, and then the destroyer hurries away to catch up to a fleet you have learned to imagine as inevitable. But imagine this: a captain who refuses to go deep and disappear. A destroyer ordered to swat a nuisance and ordered next to rejoin a body. A flight leader who chooses trust in the logic of battle over the arithmetic of fuel. Place their moments side by side. Their edges match. This is how hinges look when you strip the paint. Midway at 10:20 that morning is either an accident or an inevitability, depending on which god you worship. The tidy account runs like this. The torpedo squadrons attack and are butchered. Nagamo keeps his decks busy with confusion. Planes armed for one job and then rearmed for another. The Japanese cap is low and pointed wrong. The American dive bombers appear at altitude and push their noses over the moment all theater men call the cue and deliver fire into order. The untidy account adds things. It adds a white line on the sea and a captain's obstinacy. It adds a destroyer's hurry and a codebreaker's fatigue. It adds a Yorktown pilot's surprise at finding the enemy he needed to find because someone else had pointed unknowingly at them with his stern. That untidiness is not decoration. It is the truth. McCluskey's Dauntlesses, running out of gasoline and good chances, climbed to give their dive more kind manners. SBDs look dumpy around the hangar and aggressive when their noses angle down. He divided his Force One squadron to the left, one to the right, because choice is control, and control is mercy to men in cockpits. At 10:22, as if Sunday service had been declared, blue planes fell out of a blue sky. Richard Halsey, Vic Best, austere as a blade, aimed at Akagi and stitched her deck with a trio of bombs that turned fuel and planes and men into a single thing. Fire finding a shape. On Kaga, Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher's VB-6 turned a flat top into a bonfire with ordnance that would later be measured in diagrams and remembered in stories told by men whose eyebrows never grew back quite right. From Yorktown, Max Leslie and his dive bombers dropped their loads, some without arming pins properly pulled, and still found Soryu's lungs. Meanwhile, under all this, Nautilus moved as if nothing up there mattered. In a submarine, you measure time by your decisions rather than the skies. Brockman surfaced to periscope depth and saw Kaga wounded and Akagi burning in a way that makes a man's stomach drop. Even if it is his enemy's ship, it is hard to see that much human effort become a flame. He lined up a shot on a carrier in agony and sent another torpedo down a path choked with wreckage, smoke, and luck. Sailors later swore the torpedo hit with a hollow knock and refused to do the one thing torpedoes are paid to do. One of Nautilus's fish did explode against a nearby destroyer, converted to a patrol boat. Another, launched at a battleship, chose prematurity. The crew felt the world's sour smile and swore again quietly, with dignity. And yet, it is wrong to say Nautilus failed. The boat's value that morning lay less in ruin and more in pressure. Arashi's long attack and long return left a signature on the ocean. It also left 15 minutes of absence in the sky above the carriers. At a moment when they could least afford to be missing anything. You cannot see subtraction. You can only notice its consequences. On the Japanese flagship, Nagamo and his air officer saw one angle too few. On Enterprise, McCluskey saw one angle more. The Japanese story in those minutes deserves as much care. Their pilots had been brave for months. They did not ask their bodies to crash into their language. They had flown at Pearl, at Ceylon, and across a wide Pacific that until that morning believed itself theirs. They had trained in doctrine's clean lines. Now doctrine bunched. Planes on deck and in the hangar had to be rolled, refueled, rearmed, or rolled back. Fumes from ruptured lines had made their own doctrine and adhered to it. Gather, find a spark, obey physics. The hangar decks filled with ordnance dumped hastily in water tanks to make a Japanese bomb safe quickly safe until it wasn't. When the dive bombers arrived, they did not simply land bombs. They pulled the pin on contradictions the Japanese had been forced to swallow since dawn. Hiryu, not yet found, took the morning personally. In retaliation shoot and fury, her pilots climbed and swept down on Yorktown. Twice the flat top absorbed punishment and refused to acknowledge it in her posture, and twice her crew obeyed their training and made the improbable look like routine excellence. By afternoon she would be sacrificed to a last hot bite before the throat closes. The battle the one above the waterline soaked the day in immediacy. The battle below Nautilus's battle stayed quiet, held in decisions that renounced glory. The romance of single moments needs company with facts. After 10:22, the battle had been largely decided, but not finished. Nautilus prowled near burning machines, like a torpedo salesman living above a shop with stubborn products. She found a wounded enemy destroyer, Yamakaze, days later, and in a different patch of ocean, delivered a fish that honored its purpose at last. She shadowed a battleship, escorting the wounded, and sent a torpedo that reminded admirals that this ocean had teeth at every depth. When you tally a war, you count ships sunk and lives lost and machines broken. When you judge a morning, you measure intent and consequences that ripple outward, sometimes in ways that take decades to come ashore. The hinge we are teasing out the line Arashi drew, and the choice McCluskey made to follow it, requires an honesty about chance. You cannot force such coincidence into the tame space of a plan, but you can create the conditions in which chance rewards one side more than another. Nimitz created those conditions by believing a whispered certainty from cryptanalysts, who were often ignored by admirals who loved their binoculars. Spruance and Fletcher honored those conditions by staying supple at sea. Brockman and McCluskey made decisions inside them that feel, in hindsight, like the only decisions any sane man could make. They were not obvious at the time. Their guts earned their reputations. Long after Midway, the story we tell about it grew clean. Turning points need to feel like architecture. But in the days that followed, the Pacific did not present tidy corridors. The United States still had a labor of learning ahead. Nautilus returned to port with a captain who answered, in formal language, a question that has to be asked without appetite. Why didn't your torpedoes do what they were built to do? His report joined a stack of similar letters written by men whose nights had been bent into angles by explosions that never came. The Bureau of Ordnance defended the Mark 14 with wounded pride. The sea and the statistics defended the captains. By late 1943, and after too many risks turned into graves, the exploder problem was finally acknowledged, the depth-setting fallacy addressed, the detonator redesigned. The American submarine force began to hit what it shot at, and when it hit, it sank. That change, multiplied by hundreds of boats and thousands of close calls, starved Japan. It choked oil in the lanes between Borneo and the home islands, erased Marus from charts, and taught the empire that expansion is a verb only if someone else fuels it for you. It is an odd truth that the most important thing about the torpedo at Midway might be its refusal to explode. That failure felt in Nautilus's bones pressed a service into fixing itself. And once fixed, that service changed the war's tempo in a way no single battle can. But we're ahead of ourselves. Return to the men on Nautilus and the day of the hinge. They had names beyond their ranks, and a way of laughing that comes from having nothing to prove to each other. Their chief machinist's mate knew the boat as you know an animal you've raised, quirks and groans, and the cough in a bearing that foretells a bad afternoon. The quartermaster drew a little compass in the margin of his notebook, as if the world could be kept orderly with a familiar shape. The cook convinced the coffee to behave and coaxed a pan of biscuits into something you could call breakfast with a straight face. Men who fire torpedoes are the same species as men who wash pans. In boats like this, their skills braid. Up above, on decks so slick, a man could mistake them for safety. Someone on a Japanese carrier had chalked something on a bulkhead that morning. Short words about duty and honor, because some words are easier to write large. When you do not know, you will never read them again. After the American bombs, after the heat, crews that had trained for speed discovered that speed can be a trap when it meets the wrong kind of fire. In the water that became a garden of debris and oil, men clung to rafts and planks and their ideas of the world. Air smelled of paint and burning fuel, a perfume of endings. There is a tendency among those of us who tell these stories to prepare a single hero and a single deed, polish them, and mount them in a case labeled Turning Point. Resist this for a better thing. Understand instead the company of decisions. On Midway's morning, Nimitz's acceptance of Rochefort's codebreaking, Spruance's calm, Fletcher's willingness to heed, Najumo's indecision, the kind made inevitable by doctrine and insufficient intelligence, McCluskey's choice to trust a destroyer's wake, Best's precision over Akagi, the doomed courage of the torpedo squadrons that built a ladder of minutes others climbed, and the stubbornness of a lieutenant commander in a long submarine who would not do the sensible thing at the sensible time because he sensed that the ocean was the smallest it would ever be for him right then. If you want a detail to hold in your hand when you tell someone the story at a kitchen table, take this one. In the Enterprise ready room before the dive, McCluskey stood before men who had already learned how small they might become in the sky and told them to fly a bit longer than felt wise. He did not promise glory. He promised only an honest chance to be useful. Then, in a different room, steel-walled, Brockman told his men, "We'll stay up," and felt 37 small decisions around him align with his. The parallel belongs on paper, if only so we can see it when we forget. After Midway, Nautilus kept working. The Pacific is made of mornings like this, and also of long, dull days where the sun sets without having been asked a single heroic thing. She sank the destroyer Yamakasi later that June with a torpedo that carried none of the mark. 14's old vanities. Just war's one honest task completed. She patrolled among Aleutian cold and tropical heat. Her crew traded out, one by one, replaced by men who had listened to their stories, half brag, half horror, and decided to pay admissions anyway. The Japanese found their story closing. They fought their way into Solomons and out again. Carriers that had seemed permanent became names men whispered with a wince. Shogaku, Zuikaku, Hiryu burning northwest of Midway's wake. They retrained pilots too quickly, turned schoolhouses into factories, and discovered that a doctrine built on virtuosity requires time the calendar refused to give them. Fuel disappeared into commas on requisition forms, never arriving, always promised. Submarines carved arteries. Aircraft hacked muscle. Administration became hope. Hope became message traffic written in a language made of brave lies. Had Nautilus's torpedoes worked perfectly that morning, we would still be forced to give the destroyer's wake to McCluskey and the bombs to Dick Best and his fellow divers. The hinge would not move under different fingers. And yet, try to remove Nautilus entirely. Remove the depth charges she attracted, the delay she induced, the line Arashi drew. Turn McCluskey back early to his carrier. Imagine the dive bombers not above the carriers at the fatted moment, but arriving when decks were clearer, cap higher, doctrine less bent. The battle's result could still tilt American, but it would be a thinner victory, earned later, and thinner victories produce different tomorrows. We are not required to alchemize chance into destiny to admit this. By evening on June 4th, the Pacific was dark and men were older. Midway is remembered because it reversed a story that had begun in smoke at Pearl. It clipped the feathers of an air arm that had believed, with some justification, it knew the sky's personal name. It gave the United States time, always the most valuable thing a nation at war, can die, and turned that time into Guadalcanal, into the long submarine campaign against Japanese commerce, into the island hopping that made maps look like stones laid across a river. It opened a sequence that ended in a bay near Tokyo in 1945, when men signed their names and pretended that signatures can translate grief correctly. What did one submarine change? Not the entire war. Not even the battle's outcome all by itself. She changed a morning inside the battle, decisively enough that the morning could afford to be remembered for something else. She inflicted delay and drew a line that another man recognized and followed. That line, which exists now in phrases like McCluskey followed Arashi's wake, is more than an anecdote. It is a study in how wars turn, with little choices that are not little to the men making them, with patience that refuses to ask permission, with small machines that persist in a field dominated by larger ones. When we honor the dive bomber's coup de grace, we should also honor the persistence below that made the coup possible. There is another change, quieter. Nautilus's duds, her torpedoes' refusal to fulfill their purpose, helped pry open a bureaucracy that needed prying. The men who came back angry wrote reports that were prayers for honesty, and eventually their prayers were answered. When the Mark 14's guts were fixed and the Navy sacrificed pride for accuracy, American submariners began to dismantle Japan's war without fanfare. They sank tanker after tanker. They erased shipyards' effort as soon as it hit salt water. They carried aviators from downed planes to safety. They put special operators ashore on nights no one remembers. And the arc of the Pacific War bent under their weight as surely as it bent under the weight of carriers and Marines and B-29s. If you want to take from Nautilus a single instruction for life outside war, it is this: insist on truth in tools. The men on Nautilus went home to lives their boat had not prepared them for, and yet had prepared them for perfectly. They kept hands busy. They distrusted easy answers. They told stories late at night to sons and daughters who heard the music of steel in their parents' voices and did not know what it was until they were older. Some of the men did not like to be thanked. Some needed it. All belong to each other in a way particular to people who have been sealed inside a tube with explosions for a vocabulary, and emerged with the idea that obedience and improvisation are not enemies. Return in your mind to the periscope's view, a small circle of world, moving quickly enough that it must be arrested every few degrees and sipped rather than gulped. In that circle, a destroyer's stern careens away, white water writing a sentence without commas. Above, an aviator glances down, sees the sentence, reads it correctly, and turns. Below, a commander steadies while the Pacific shouts. Charts in future classrooms will show arrows, red and blue, tidy based on the narrator's bias. Those charts are the end of the story, not the story. The story is this. 3 men Brockman, the captain of Arashi, McCluskey, each doing his job, each believing in the logic of his trade, intersected long enough to push a day in a new direction. The submarine's power is mostly negative. It subtracts. It takes away visibility, stability, certainty. It forces an enemy to look down as well as up. It removes fuel and cargo, and the illusion that steel can guarantee anything. The beauty of what Nautilus did at Midway is that her subtraction created addition added minutes to an American attack, added confusion to a Japanese defense, added a thread to a rope that, when enough were laid, could pull down an empire's boldness. We should be careful, in our age of smooth stories, to leave room for rough ones. Accept that dud torpedoes and unhappy bureaucrats sit next to courage in the same chapter. Accept that a submarine's greatest gift was not a sinking, but an arrow sketched on a morning sea by her hunter. Accept that what changes wars often looks like insistence rather than brilliance. And accept, importantly, that luck is not the enemy of skill. It is the reward of skill placed in the right place at the right time and then left alone long enough to do its work. So here's the quiet call you can take with you when the credits would otherwise roll. Look for the small hinge. In your work, your family, your city, find the choice that will not be noticed if you get it right, the one that makes someone else's decisive moment possible. Be the submarine beneath the storm, persistent and patient, insistent on truth, ungilded, necessary. Few will remember your name. That is not a failing. It is the point. And if you ever stand on a pier and look out over a flat piece of water, imagine a long steel shape just below it, the air above her vibrating with the destroyer's engines far away, and a line being drawn for someone else to find. In that imagining, you have honored a boat and a morning that changed the Pacific War, not by demanding credit, but by making consequence.